I'm Larry Howe. I have the privilege of being the San Diego County Democratic Party Vice Chairman for the East Area and also President of the La Mesa Foothills Democratic Club. I'm now going to ask someone to come up to introduce our speaker for this evening. This gentleman is one of the mainstays of the effort being orchestrated in East County to attempt to deal with this Blackwater issue. He also happens to be the president of the East County Democratic Club. Would you please join me in welcoming Ray Less?
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming tonight, and again, thank you to the Mesa Democratic Club for helping us host this. A little quick advertising: you can get your membership forms in the back, and become a member if you'd like. I'm not going to talk a lot about the particular issues here tonight because I'd rather you go to our website at stopblackwater.net and we'll go over the videos there and all kinds of information. But I'd like to just give you a little snapshot about what has happened in the last few weeks, a couple of months that has happened here. And really it's based on an idea. What we saw in the last election was we didn't have any good success on getting good candidates to replace some of the most corrupt politicians that I've seen around, that you may know that work around here. And we just didn't have good candidates. We didn't get the thing, and we started to elect Democrats. So instead, we started a thing called citizens oversight. Okay. Now look, you're a citizen in a democracy, and it's your job to oversee the entire government. But that's a pretty big job, especially when the media does nothing to help you. They're part of the government now. They're not going to help you oversee it. So we're on our own again, folks. That means the idea is that everyone, or if they can, will dedicate 1 or 2 nights a week to go and sit on meetings. You go into the meetings and you watch what they're doing. Just having some citizens in there will help them change the climate from passing out goodies to everybody into trying to do a good job, maybe. And you may find out that, gee, I can do a better job than these guys. Maybe I'll run for office. So, you know, that can work. If you want to do that, contact me and we'll find out a good place for you to go and to sit on some of these meetings as well. We've set some up for the El Cajon City Council, Rosemont Healthcare Board, Valley View Oral Planning Group, and we heard about the Potrero Planning Group having some sort of a problem out there. Didn't quite know what it was. I heard about Blackwater, but didn't think it was anything serious. So I went out after hearing a bit more about it on March 8th. I went to their planning group meeting. We had about 30 residents there, some of them probably here tonight, and a reporter and myself. I was the only person that was outside the community that had seen how to deal with these folks. And it was a circus. I mean, they weren't doing anything right. They were not letting people speak anonymously, which is a problem because if you've got a 824-acre mercenary training camp going in with people that may be carrying guns with an 18,000 square foot armory, that's almost half an acre of guns and ammunition. You may be worried about speaking up against that organization and identifying yourself. So I can relate to that person. And so this is how I was giving them support. As I learned more about this, one of our members happens to be a U.S. Navy SEAL commander. He said, well, I can have Blackwater VP come to your meeting and explain it. And it's a good idea. Okay, well, have them come in and let's talk about it. I'd love to hear why this is a great idea. And of course, they didn't show up. They had some sort of, well, we're busy that day. I said, well, you probably have thousands of people in your firm. You can't find anybody to come to work. No, it's just no. So we had Duncan and Fetchers of Sabre Rangelands and Forest describe how they're taking over this beautiful valley. I encourage you to take a look at the picture back there. That day he brought in the book from Jeremy Scahill, Blackwater. It had just been published 5 days earlier. I said, great. Called him up, his publicist, and said, we want a meeting. And that's how this meeting wound up. Since then, we've had lucky things happen. Earth Fair, we passed out a bunch of stuff there. We've had Democratic convention. We tried to put a resolution through and had one person that objected, and so we're still working on it. So the latest off this now is to get a public outcry. That's why I encourage everybody's here to hear about this. We're lucky to have Jeremy Scahill here today. He's a full-fledged investigative journalist. This is the kind of reporter we want to have more, and that's what Soul is. He's frequently contributed to Nation magazine and correspondent for the national radio and television show Democracy Now! And he's reported extensively, and this is what's good about Jeremy. He's actually been in Iraq, Yugoslavia, Nigeria, and these other countries. He knows what he's talking about. He's currently a Puffin Foundation Writing Fellow at the Nation Institute. And of course, the book, please purchase one and have them sign it. Please help me welcome right now Jeremy Scahill.
I can't say I've met too many fire marshals in my life, but I suppose it's a good thing. What a great community you have here. This is my first time in San Diego, and I've spent a few days here, and I can say you have a great community here. I just came back from visiting Potrero, and we had a little informal town hall meeting out there with people. And it's really my honor to meet the folks of Potrero. What a peaceful community, what a beautiful landscape, and I'm a journalist, so I'll just say this. I hope that 824 acres remains as beautiful as it was today. I just want to know, how many of you were at the event last night in San Diego? All right, I'm glad there's not so many. I want to be able to get into all the stories. But one of the things that I mentioned this last night that I particularly am doing here in San Diego is carrying around a folder with some of the research materials from my book in case some Blackwater lawyers are lurking about. I don't know if you know this, but Blackwater has enlisted a high-powered series of Republican law firms to represent it on various matters. One of the early lawyers for the company was Fred Fielding, who's now President Bush's White House counsel, defending him against the attorney Curtis scandal and all the other scandals that seem to be dominating Washington today. More recently, the lawyer for Blackwater has been Kenneth Starr, the man in charge against President Clinton, the dean of the Pepperdine Law School. I wish I was kidding, but I'm not. Now, I'm not much of one for reading from my book. I like to talk to the folks that come out, but I do want to begin tonight by thanking all of you for coming out tonight. Thank you to Raymond and the other folks for organizing this event. It was one of the first calls that came in as we began organizing this 30-city book tour. And it really is an honor to be here, and it's an honor to be with the people of Potrero. As I said, I'm not much one for reading, but I do want to begin by reading a small section from my book because it's an incident that I think for many of us put these, they refer to them now as private contractors. In this community, I think you know what a contractor really is. They're building things. They're building bridges, they're building roads, maybe they're building schools, maybe they're engaged in construction. Well, we now use this term private contractors to describe mercenary forces operating in Iraq, Afghanistan, and also here inside of the United States. Of course, now you're well aware of it in the San Diego area, but this incident was really the moment that these private forces came into the consciousness of many of us and their function in Iraq. This incident began on the morning of March 31st, 2004 in the city of Fallujah, Iraq. When the four Americans rolled into Fallujah in their two Pyro Jeeps, the Iraqi Mujahideen and the city of mosques were waiting for them. The main drag that cuts through the city is lined with restaurants, cafes, and souks. On ordinary days, throngs of people mill around. But early that morning, a small group of gun-masked men had detonated an explosive device, clearing the streets and causing shopkeepers to shutter their stores. From the moment of the convoy of Americans entered the city limits, the men stood out. They were driving vehicles known widely in Iraq as bullet magnets. They sported wraparound sunglasses and Tom Cruise haircuts. Shortly after they entered Fallujah, the jeeps began to slow. To their right were shops and markets. To the left, open space. They hit some sort of a roadblock. As the vehicles came to a standstill, a grenade was hurled at the rear jeep, quickly followed by the rip of machine gun fire. Bullets tore through the side of the rear Cairo like salt from ice, fatally wounding two men inside. As the blood gushed from them, masked gunmen moved in on the jeeps, unloading cartridges of ammo, pounding their way through the windshield. Chants of Allahu Akbar, God is great, filled the air. Soon more than a dozen young men who'd been hanging out in front of the local kebab house joined in the frenzy. By the time the rear jeep was shot up, the Americans in the lead vehicle realized that an ambush was underway. They tried to flee, but it was too late. The crowd quickly swelled toward the 300 people as the original attackers faded into the side streets of Fallujah. The jeeps were soon engulfed in flames. The scorched bodies of the Americans were pulled out. Men and boys literally ripped them apart limb from limb. In front of the TV cameras, a young man held a small sign emblazoned with a skull and crossbones that declared in English, Fallujah is the graveyard of the Americans. The mob hung the charred, lifeless remains of the Americans from a bridge over the Euphrates River, where they would remain for hours, forming an eerily iconic image that was seen on television screens throughout the world. Thousands of miles away in Washington, D.C., President Bush was on the campaign trail, speaking at a fundraiser dinner. This collection of killers is trying to shake our will, the president told his supporters. America will never be intimidated by thugs and assassins. We're aggressively striking at the terrorists in Iraq, and we'll defeat them there so we do not have to face them in our own country. The next morning, Americans woke up to the news of the gruesome killings. The Iraqi mob mutilates 4 American civilians, is a typical newspaper headline. Somalia was frequently invoked, referring to the incident in October of 1993, when rebels in Mogadishu shot down 2 Black Hawk helicopters, killed 18 U.S. soldiers, and dragged some of them through the streets, prompting the Clinton administration to withdraw forces. But unlike Somalia, the men killed in Fallujah were not members of the U.S. military, at least not on active duty, nor were they civilians, as many news outlets reported. They were highly trained private soldiers sent to Iraq by a secretive mercenary company based in the wilderness of North Carolina. Its name is Blackwater, USA. For many of us, I think it was the first time we ever heard of these heavily armed private forces operating in a U.S. war zone. And of course, what happened as a result of the brutal murder of these 4 men was that the Bush administration went over the heads of the commanders on the ground in Iraq, as it's done so systematically from the moment this war began and even in the run-up to the war. The commanders around Fallujah decided that it would be too dangerous to go in by force to the city of Fallujah. They felt that it would cause deaths in Fallujah, among them U.S. soldiers. And so they were trying to take an approach that they defined as a hearts and minds approach. Once these 4 Blackwater men were killed, the Bush administration put a siege on the fast track. You have to remember, the big story at the time was this whole thing, this phrase that the Bush administration floated, the handover of sovereignty. As though sovereignty is something that's just bestowed upon a population. They were intent on handing over this sovereignty by June of 2004. Bremer needed to get out of the country, skulk out of Baghdad. And what they needed to do was to crush the Iraqi resistance, and they were looking for a moment to do that, because at the time, you had the Shiites and the Sunnis sort of in the early stages of rising up against the occupation. And so the deaths of these 4 men gave the Bush administration that spark to lay siege to Fallujah. The U.S. forces were ordered to surround the city of 350,000 people. One of the first things that they did was to bomb the main power plant, sending the city into darkness. Fallujah is a city I've been to several times in my years of going in and out of Iraq. In fact, I had camped out there in the desert near Fallujah in the summer of 2002, something that would be unthinkable today. As the forces surrounded the city, U.S. psychological operations teams were deployed. They competed with each other on who could come up with the filthiest insults to have translated into Arabic and then shouted through loudspeakers into the city. And when they would shout these insults, people from Fallujah would emerge from buildings firing off their Kalashnikovs, and then they would be gunned down. The troops on the ground began referring to this as Lala Fallujah. The eerie soundtrack to this display was often the music of AC/DC and Guns N' Roses. In all, U.S. forces carried out about 37,000 airstrikes against the city. They destroyed or damaged 19,000 of the city's 39,000 buildings. Hundreds of people were killed. U.S. soldiers were killed. Thousands of people were displaced from their homes. A good friend of mine, an independent reporter in the Darja Mail, was able to make it into the city of Fallujah during the siege. And when he got there, he reported that U.S. snipers were firing at ambulances trying to retrieve the wounded. He said that the bodies were piling up in the city and that a stench of death had overtaken the city. And he said that it got so horrible that citizens of Fallujah started to turn 2 football fields into a mass grave to bury the dead. So the U.S. went in and, on the orders of Bush, totally destroyed the city of Fallujah. It was the moment that the Iraq War turned. It was the moment that the violence and attacks against U.S. soldiers escalated dramatically. We've seen a sea of destructive policies in Iraq initiated not so much by the commanders of the military, but by the political leaders in the White House. This company, Blackwater USA, responded to the killing of 4 of its men in Fallujah and this unsought-out rise to prominence in the international media. They responded to it by, the day after, hiring one of the most powerful Republican lobbying firms in the country. It's a company called the Alexander Strategy Group. It was founded and staffed by former senior staffers of then House Majority Leader Tom DeWay. This is a Jack Abramoff-connected lobbying firm. On March 31st, 2004, 4 of their men are killed. On April 1st, 2004, they hired the Alexander Strategy Group. Their high-powered, well-connected Republican lobbyists start taking them around the Hill. Within days of that ambush, Eric Prince, the owner of Blackwater, and other company executives had a series of face-to-face meetings with the men who literally ran the Congress and set the defense policy for the legislative branch of this government. After those killings happened and they hired the Alexander Strategy Group in April of 2004, by June of 2004, Blackwater was awarded a $320 million contract to provide so-called diplomatic security services for the U.S. State Department. We have to understand in talking about Blackwater that this is a company that basically didn't exist a decade ago. But in those 10 years, it's risen to become one of the most powerful private actors in the so-called global war on terror. This company has had $750 million, $750 million in State Department contracts alone since June of 2004. That doesn't count the work Blackwater does for the U.S. military, for the Central Intelligence Agency, for other private corporations. It's Blackwater in Iraq that guards the U.S. ambassador, senior diplomats, officials, occupation outposts, not the U.S. military. Blackwater guards visiting congressional delegations that go in and out of Iraq. This is a company that has forces actively deployed in 9 countries around the world. Everywhere where the Bush administration's wars seem to pop up, we find Blackwater on the scene. What I want to do tonight, especially because we're here in San Diego and you're facing the prospect of this company expanding into your community, is unpack a little bit of the company history, tell you a little bit about the background, about the people that run this company, and then you can decide for yourself if this is the kind of business that you want in your community. Blackwater, as I said, was founded by a man named Eric Prince. He comes from a powerhouse Republican Christian conservative family in the state of Michigan. His father was a very successful businessman. His company was called Prince Manufacturing. They serviced the auto industries through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and the most famous invention, perhaps, of the company was the now ubiquitous lighted sun visor. You're driving around in your car, and you pull down your visor, and it lights up. You've got a little bit of Blackwater's history in your vehicle. They also had some inventions that didn't quite work out, like a ham deboning machine and a lighted sock drawer, which actually I think would be kind of handy. Now, it was important that young Eric Prince, the founder of Blackwater, watched his father run a successful business. Prince certainly has run one over there in Boyac, North Carolina. But more important than watching the success of his father's business was that he saw his dad use the company as a cash-generating engine to fuel and fund the rise of the Republican Revolution of 1994, which brought Newt Gingrich and the Contract with America to power, as well as the rise of several of the key groups that now make up what we know as the religious right movement in this country. Edgar Prince, Eric Prince's father, gave the seed money to Gary Bauer to start the Family Research Council. Gary Bauer, of course, is often a Republican presidential candidate. He's about as far to the right as you can get. He's the man who declared war on SpongeBob SquarePants. They also gave significant support and funding to James Dobson and his focus on the Family Prayer Warrior Network. Those two groups are two of the 5 most powerful radical Christian right groups operating in this country. They have had an incredible amount of influence over government and policy in this country, particularly under the administration of George W. Bush. Eric Prince was an early intern in the Family Research Council, and he did a string of internships that are very telling. He was an intern at George H.W. Bush's White House, but he complained that it wasn't conservative enough for him on gay issues, on the budget, on the environment. He also has some local California ties because he was an intern in the office of Republican Congressman Dana Rohrabacher. Rohrabacher, of course, is certainly well known to this community, and he is an interesting guy. He was a senior aide to Ronald Reagan during his time in the White House, and Rohrabacher was a speechwriter for Reagan. And after leaving the White House, he ran for Congress. He wins his congressional seat, and in the months between the election and starting to serve his congressional term, Rohrabacher runs over to Afghanistan to fight on the side of the Mujahideen in the war against the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. Eric Prince's sister, Eric Prince, again, the founder of Blackwater, his sister Betsy, married a guy named Dick DeVos. Dick DeVos is the heir to the Amway Corporation, the owners of the Orlando Magic basketball team, the single greatest bankrollers of the Republican Revolution. They're also from the state of Michigan. These two families merged together in the kind of marriage that was commonplace in the monarchies of old Europe. Together, they formed this behind-the-scenes power player in the politics and political movements that now dominate this country. And so these are the folks, the forces that dominated the landscape or peppered the landscape of young Eric Prince's upbringing. His dream, his vision in life was to be a military man. He's believed to be one of the wealthiest people ever to enlist in the U.S. Navy SEALs, the elite SEALs. Eric Prince in the 90s served in Haiti, Bosnia, the Mediterranean, and then in the mid-90s, tragedy struck his family. His father died suddenly of a heart attack. His young wife had cancer. Eric Prince goes back to Michigan, helps the family sort through what they're going to do with the business. Ultimately, through deliberations, they decide to sell Prince Manufacturing for $1.3 billion in cash. Eric Prince leaves active duty with the SEALs, heads out to North Carolina, gets together with a bunch of other guys he met in the SEALs and elsewhere in Special Forces, and they incorporate a company that at the time was called Blackwater Lodge and Training Center. And it was to be built on the Great Dismal Swamp of North Carolina on 5,000 acres of land originally, stretching across 2 counties, Currituck and Camden County. At the beginning, it was sort of envisioned, and this may sound similar to some of you, as a sportsman's paradise, a place where people could come and train, a place where gun enthusiasts could come and fire off their weapons. But also, there was early company literature that seemed to indicate that the company intended to take advantage of accelerated government outsourcing of firearms and security-related training. Blackwater existed sort of in obscurity for the first couple of years that it was in business. In 1998, there were 2 congressmen who went out to be present for the grand opening of Blackwater. Rohrabacher was one of them. The other was John Doolittle. At the time, they were portrayed as staunch defenders of the Second Amendment in the press release that was issued. So Blackwater, as I said, was sort of an unknown company, and when it sort of first had its moment was in 1999 when the Columbine shooting happened. Blackwater responded to that shooting by erecting a mock high school on their compound in North Carolina, and it was called Are You Ready High? And they invited law enforcement agents from around the country to come and train in how to face down against the violent youth of American high schools. It was the first of what would sort of be annual tragedies that would end up benefiting Blackwater. The next one came in 2000 when the USS Cole was bombed off the coast of Yemen. I'm sure people remember that. A number of sailors were killed in that attack. The Navy awarded Blackwater a $35 million contract to train sailors in how to defend their vessels or ships against such attacks. So the real money for Blackwater didn't start rolling in until 9/11. Eric Prince from Blackwater seldom does interviews. The most recent one that he did was an email interview with the Virginian Pilot newspaper, which is right there in his community. But he did do at least one television interview, and you might be able to guess what network he went to after 9/11. You might even be able to guess the show. O'Reilly. So he goes on O'Reilly's program, and they were talking about the Federal Air Marshal program. Eric Prince at one point says he was starting to be a little cynical about how seriously people took the business of security and training. But he noted that after 9/11, the phone has been ringing off the hook. Among the early calls to come into Blackwater was from the Central Intelligence Agency, which contracted the company to send a small team of former Special Forces guys into Afghanistan in the early stages of U.S. operations there. Eric Prince himself, he's only 37 years old right now. He went in with that initial team of Blackwater guys to Afghanistan and remained in the country for a couple of weeks. That was the moment that Blackwater, at least as far as we know, because covert contracts are very difficult for anyone to get a hold of, but as far as we know, that was the moment that Blackwater had crossed the line from being a training company to being a mercenary force providing soldiers for hire to the U.S. government and other entities. When U.S. tanks rolled into Baghdad in March of 2003, they brought with them the largest army of private personnel ever deployed in a modern war zone. In the 1991 Gulf War, the ratio was about 60 soldiers to every one troop. The Bush administration now has almost a 1-to-1 ratio on the ground in Iraq. You see, most of us, I think, in this room believe the U.S. has about 145,000 troops on the ground. Seldom mentioned is the fact that there are 126,000 private contractors. Now, tens of thousands of these contractors work for KBR, for instance. They do logistical support activities that traditionally have been the work of other soldiers in the military, but there's been this privatization drive, downsizing of the military, upsizing of the private sector. So you have people that are doing laundry for the troops, they're doing food services, they're driving trucks, but you also have tens of thousands who are heavily armed mercenaries that are on U.S. government payroll inside of Iraq today. Among these, the most powerful is Blackwater USA. And so when U.S. tanks rolled in and began the process of occupying the country, Saddam, his government collapses, Bush sends in an ally of his, Paul Bremer. They hit the ground, and it seems that Bremer's job in Iraq was to destroy the Iraqi economy. Bremer hits the ground in Iraq, and one of the first things that he does is issue an order that would prove disastrous. It was his de-Ba'athification plan. Now, hundreds of thousands of Iraqis were summarily fired from their jobs. Some of them were teachers, some of them were doctors, nurses, some of them worked in civil society or as engineers. But at least 250,000 of them were Iraqi troops. The U.S. comes in, and they immediately fire 250,000 Iraqi troops. In my book, I quote one U.S. official as saying, that was the day we made 250,000 armed enemies inside of Iraq. If we want to look at how all of this violence began escalating, how we ended up in a situation where 3,400 plus men and women from this country have been killed in Iraq, we have to go back and look at the policies on the ground that were implemented by the political leaders of this country. And so when Bremer was sent in there as Bush's viceroy, or proconsul as they called him, they didn't give the job of keeping Bremer alive to the U.S. military. No, they gave it to a private company. Blackwater was awarded a $27 million contract to provide the elite bodyguard services for Paul Bremer as he ran around Iraq. They provided helicopters, armored vehicles, former Navy SEALs, other Special Forces guys to protect Paul Bremer. As one colonel says in my book, there's an interesting psychology behind the use of these private forces to keep Bremer alive. Because if the U.S. military was guarding Paul Bremer and he got killed, there'd be some kind of an investigation. Maybe in some scenario, if misconduct was found to have been committed on the part of soldiers, there would have been a court-martial. But the fact is that it probably wouldn't have gone anywhere, and Bremer would have been killed and just replaced by someone else. Well, if a private company like Blackwater is guarding Paul Bremer, the Paul Bremer gets killed, imagine what that does to the company business. The very fact that Blackwater kept Bremer alive for a year, they've used that as a marketing tool on their website. They have Paul Bremer's picture with his Blackwater guards around it. The message is clear. If we keep the most hated man in the most dangerous city on earth alive, we can do anything for your business or your government. They also have pictures of Colin Powell and Tony Blair and other folks with the Blackwater men around them. And so we have Blackwater, a private company, guarding the senior U.S. official in Iraq. I look at it as sort of the ultimate dedication to these neoliberal, neoconservative, free market politics. Bremer literally had his life placed in the hands of the powers of the almighty free market, private company. And so we return now to this Blackwater Fallujah ambush. So Paul Bremer is running around Iraq for a year. The day before he leaves the country, he issues an edict known as Order 17. It was a sort of gift, a party gift to Blackwater and other contractors in Iraq. It granted a sweeping immunity from prosecution to all contractors in Iraq under Iraqi law. In other words, a contractor could literally walk up to an Iraqi on the street, shoot them in the head, and there was nothing that any court could have done inside of Iraq. That's some handover of sovereignty, more like a rollover of sovereignty. In Iraq was Bremer's party gift to the contractors. And so the families of those 4 men who were killed in Fallujah, they went through a process that so many thousands of American families have had to go through, whether they're grappling with the death of a loved one who was in the active duty military or someone who was killed serving as a contractor in Iraq. These families, I've gotten to know them very well over the past couple of years. They say that they have no reason to presume any malice on the part of Blackwater. In fact, they thought that their loved ones were going over there to bodyguard Paul Bremer. They were doing what they'd always done. They just happen to be doing it now in the private sector, but they all consider themselves military families. Katie Halveston, whose son Scott Halveston was hung from that bridge in Fallujah, she said that she remembers very vividly the day that happened. She was sitting at her home office in Leesburg, Florida. She had CNN on in the background. Her son had just gotten to Iraq. He hadn't even been there a week. And she heard this report that civilian contractors had been killed in Fallujah. She watched the bodies burning on the bridge. She watched that. It didn't even remotely occur to her that it could have been her son, because her son's not a civilian, her son's not a contractor, her son's a military guy. And so even the families of these guys, all of them say the same thing. They had no clue that they were even talking about their loved ones over there. And so after it became clear to them that it was Blackwater, and they began calling the company, they ultimately, within 24 hours, confirmed that it was their loved ones who had been killed. They started asking questions of Blackwater about the details. What were they even doing in Fallujah? What's this we hear about them being in unarmored vehicles? What's this about being sent out short 2 men? I thought the military wasn't even going into Fallujah. And they say that Blackwater was stonewalling, not being transparent with them, not giving them answers on what had happened to their loved ones. These families pressed it and pressed it. And eventually, with all these calls coming into Moyock, North Carolina, Blackwater says, we're going to hold a memorial service for your loved ones. We're going to fly all of you out to North Carolina, and we'll have a memorial service, and Blackwater representatives will be on hand to answer any questions that you have about the incident. So they go out there to the compound, they have the memorial service. Blackwater invites them to sit down for this meeting where they can ask questions. Donna Zovko, the son Jerry Zovko, was killed there. He works at an auto supply factory in Cleveland, Ohio. She goes out there and she's talking with the Blackwater representatives. She's asking them a series of questions, and she's asking them to see an after-incident report, an after-action report. I know that you did an investigation on it. I want to see it. I want answers as to how my son was killed. She said they were kind of hemming and hawing, and she's pressing them harder and harder. Donna Zovko said that at one point a Blackwater representative stood up and said to her, it's a classified document, and you'll have to sue us to get it. This is a woman whose son was a U.S. Army Ranger. Hired by this company, Blackwater. His body was strung up from a bridge. She's asking the company that sent him there for answers. She says that they told her, you'll have to sue us to get those answers. So she left the compound that day devastated. None of these families were political folks. They were very middle American people, hardworking people. The 2 mothers got to know each other, Donna Zovko and Katie Halveston. One lived in Cleveland, one lived in Leesburg, Florida. They fly back and forth getting to know one another. They're comparing notes. They're voraciously reading every news article about the ambush of their loved ones. They start hearing from other Blackwater guys who have been over there with their sons, and they start hearing some very fishy things about the operation over there. Eventually they decide that they're going to take Blackwater up on their challenge and they're going to sue them. So in January of 2005, the families of West Badalona, Mike T., Jerry Zobko, and Scott Halvenston filed a groundbreaking wrongful death lawsuit against Blackwater USA, charging that the company had defrauded their loved ones, sent them into Fallujah in Pyero Jeeps instead of armored vehicles, sent them in short two men on their mission. In each of those two Jeeps there should have been a driver, a navigator, and a rear gunner. Sending them short two men meant no rear gunner. They were literally killed by insurgents walking up and gunning them down. And so those families charged that Blackwater was responsible for their deaths, and they filed this lawsuit against the company. Blackwater enlists these high-powered attorneys, the Fred Fieldings, the Ken Stars, and they start fighting back against the families. And what's interesting is that Blackwater hasn't made much of disputing the specific allegations of the lawsuit. Instead, they put forward a defense that goes something like this. Because the Pentagon, the Department of Defense, and Donald Rumsfeld classified contractors like Blackwater as an official part of the U.S. mobile force, we should be entitled to the same immunity from civilian litigation enjoyed by the U.S. military. At the same time, Blackwater's lobbyists from Alexander Strategy Group are speaking openly in the media, talking about how inappropriate it would be to put Blackwater's forces under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, the court-martial system. So you have a company that very publicly is saying, no court-martial system applied to our forces, no civilian litigation. We're not civilians, we're not military when it makes sense. Or we are civilians and we are military when it doesn't make sense. And so this is the message that Blackwater has projected as it's fought against this wrongful death lawsuit. I want to tell you a little bit about, we're going to come back with another story about this lawsuit at the end of the talk tonight, but I want to tell you a little bit about the background here. This didn't grow out of a vacuum. The use of mercenaries is as old as history. And even in the U.S. context, it doesn't go back to George W. Bush's administration. Tens of thousands of contractors were used, of course, in Vietnam. The CIA and other intelligence agencies have long used independent contractors. But when George H.W. Bush was in the White House and Dick Cheney was the defense secretary, at the end of their term, Cheney hires a division of Halliburton, the company who would go on ahead, to perform a study on how to privatize the military bureaucracy, basically everything except the combat functions of the military. And so they paid this Halliburton division $5 million to essentially create the world's most lucrative market for itself. And so during the 90s, after commissioning this study, Dick Cheney ends up going on to head Halliburton. And then he gets the White House again as vice president when the Bush administration takes power. And he and Rumsfeld both were these radical supporters of this privatization agenda. They were intent on fixing that 60-to-1 ratio and getting it down closer to 1-to-1. And it's interesting when you look at the political benefits of the Bush administration using these shadow forces in Iraq. How many contractors have been killed in Iraq? Well, that's interesting because no one's really paying attention. We don't know. We think that about 770 have been killed, and the reason that we know that is because their families have filed for federal death benefits with the U.S. Department of Labor. 7,700 have applied for injury benefits with the U.S. Department of Labor. You see, they get insurance under something called the Defense Base Act, which goes back to the 1940s. So we have some sense of the scale, though it's by no means a record of every contractor killed. 770, that's not counted in that official death toll that we all watch climb every day. The injury toll isn't counted in that injury toll we watch climbing every day. But what's more disturbing than their death toll is the fact that no one is effectively paying attention to the conduct of these private forces in the war zone. They have not been subjected to the court-martial system. They have not been subjected to any Iraqi law because Bremer wiped it out, nor have they been subjected to effective civilian law. There have been 64 court-martials in Iraq of U.S. soldiers on murder-related charges. Now, I think that that's probably a stunningly low number, but there are 64 court-martials that have taken place on murder-related charges. Out of the tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of contractors that have moved in and out of Iraq since March of 2003, two have been indicted or charged with any crimes. Neither of them were an armed mercenary like those that worked for Blackwater. One of them was alleged to have stabbed someone in a kitchen. The other pled guilty in possession of child pornography images on his computer at Abu Ghraib. In those two stories, you have the extent of the legal action that's been taken against this shadow force that now numbers 126,000 in Iraq. According to the U.S. Government Accountability Office, there are 48,000 employees of private military companies in Iraq, mercenary companies in Iraq. So what this means is that either we have tens of thousands of the most saintly mercenaries on earth running around Iraq, or something is very rotten with this system. The problem right now, though, is that in Congress, the debate is sort of been very narrowed down to a very small path. On the one hand, you have Senator Lindsey Graham, conservative Republican of South Carolina, former Air Force lawyer. Lindsey Graham last year manipulated some language in the Defense Authorization Act that Bush signed into law. What Lindsey Graham did is he said contractors shall be placed under the UCMJ, court-martial system. Well, the industry went bonkers about it. They said, we're civilians, you can't put us under the court-martial system. It's one area where civil liberties activists and the mercenaries might actually be on the same page in this equation. But then the plan emerging from the Democrats is also very disturbing. You see, the Democrats have this idea, the Democratic leadership has this idea that what they're going to do is set up an FBI field office in Baghdad, and that you're going to have investigators running around Iraq, the most dangerous war zone in the world, that they're going to be gathering evidence, interviewing victims, then they're going to bring charges against these contractors, and they're going to have them arrested, then they're going to bring them back to the United States, and they're going to try them in U.S. courts. I don't know about you, but how much faith do you have right now in the U.S. Justice Department? So essentially what they're saying is, don't worry, the Justice Department's going to handle this. And unfortunately, this is the plan that the Democrats are pushing right now. Now, I don't think it's born of ill intentions. I think that there are several Democrats who are so outraged at the lack of accountability that they're scraping to try to figure out some way to have accountability. But there's something unfortunate going on here. Representative John Bertha says we need to bring accountability to an unaccountable war. I disagree with it. We need to bring an end to the unaccountable war. We have a system right now that is thriving in Iraq of people and companies whose entire livelihood depends on misery, suffering, and conflict. We have allowed this administration to accelerate a system where corporate profits are linked to war making. And what we need to get Congress to do right now is to de-link that corporate profiteering from the system of U.S. defense. We need to push for effective anti-mercenary legislation in this country. And it's certainly not going to come from the White House. And so it's extremely important right now to put pressure on representatives to take on this issue effectively, to have open public hearings, to subpoena the heads of these companies that are profiting from the war in Iraq and call them to account in hearings that everyone has access to. The Bush administration has used these mercenary forces to subvert democratic processes in this country. You see, they want to keep a draft off the table. They want to cut the citizenry out of the equation. If you have your military running it into the ground, Colin Powell said the active duty army is about broken. The war hasn't broken the active duty military. The White House has broken the military. This White House has sent U.S. forces to engage in an offensive war of occupation. The vast majority of the people in this country no longer see, if they ever did, anything having to do with the defense of our country happening in Iraq right now. And so what the Bush administration failed to do was build a coalition of willing nations. And so what they did was build a coalition of building corporations, like those from Blackwater, DynCorp, and Triple Canopy. And just to give you a sense of the attitude of some of these forces on the ground, there was a great article in the Washington Post a few weeks ago by a journalist named Steve Faineroot. And he did a story about a company called Triple Canopy. One of these armed mercenary contractors said to him, "We were always told from the very beginning, if for some reason something happened and the Iraqis were trying to prosecute us, they'd put you in the back of a car and sneak you out of the country in the middle of the night." He said the U.S. contractors had their own motto, "What happens here today stays here today." Are these the kinds of individuals that we want acting in our name anywhere in the world? What happens here today stays here today. These are companies that Congress members have been trying to get information on for years. Representative Jan Schakowsky said that she's a Democrat from Illinois on the Select Intelligence Committee in the House. She said that sometimes she's been allowed to see some of the contracts, but she has to go into a room and she can't bring writing utensils with her. And she's not allowed to talk about it once she leaves the room. She estimates that 40 cents of every tax dollar being spent on the occupation of Iraq is going to these private companies. Henry Waxman of the Oversight Committee says $4 billion alone has been spent on these private security companies, as they call themselves. We have allowed the situation to go on for too long, where the American people are kept away from oversight of what's being done with our tax dollars. I only have a few moments here. I don't want to get us in trouble with the fire marshal, but I do want to get to the issue at hand here for you folks in San Diego. In order to talk about what's going on in Potrero right now, we have to talk about another incident, part of history that I'm sure is very familiar to everyone here. I was in New Orleans right after Hurricane Katrina hit, and I got there a few days after the hurricane. And when I was there was no effective humanitarian operation going on. There was no Red Cross inside the city center. There was one FEMA vehicle that I saw that appeared to have been abandoned. There was almost no humanitarian operation going on, and there was almost no National Guard. Why? Because the Bush administration had sent the National Guard of Louisiana over to Iraq and Afghanistan. So I'm standing on a corner of Bourbon Street in the French Quarter, talking to two New York City police officers. I'm from New York. They had come down with the New York Fire Department to help. As they're sitting there chatting on the corner, this compact car speeds up. It's got no license plates on it. Three massive guys get out of it. They're wearing khaki uniforms, flak jackets, wielding M4 assault rifles, pistols strapped to their legs, and they come up to the cops and they say, "Where are the rest of the Blackwater guys?" Without skipping a beat, as though they had just been asked the time of day, the police officer said, "They're just up that way." They get back into their car and they speed away. And I said to the cops, "Blackwater, you mean like the guys over in Iraq?" And they said, "Oh yeah, they're all over the place down there." And I said, where can I find them to go and interview them?" They said, "You can walk either way on the street." So I went deeper down into on Bourbon Street, met up with a bunch of Blackwater guys standing on a corner and struck up a conversation with them. I said, "What are you guys doing down here?" He said, "We're here to help." I said, "Who sent you down here?" "Our boss." I said, "What's your mission down here?" He said, "We're here to confront criminals and stop looters." One of them had just been in Iraq 2 weeks ago. He'd been a bodyguard for the U.S. ambassador there. Another one was complaining that there wasn't enough action in New Orleans. Now, I don't know about you, but when I'm talking to a mercenary who was just in Iraq and he tells me that there's not enough action in the streets of New Orleans, that sends chills down my spine. Another guy's talking on his cell phone. He's saying to his friend, "You don't want to come down here and work with Blackwater. They're only paying $350 a day, $350 a day per man, plus a per diem." So as I talked to these guys, I said, "Under whose authority are you operating down here?" And they said, "Well, I was deputized by the governor of the state of Louisiana. He chose a gold law enforcement badge. He said, we can use lethal force if we deem it necessary." And as I talked to them more and more, someone mentioned something about a Department of Homeland Security camp outside of New Orleans. And I said, "Well, are you on contract with the Department of Homeland Security?" And the guy says to me, "Oh, it's way above my pay grade." So I start looking into it, other journalists start looking into it. The federal government denies it's hired in private security. They say, "We have all the security forces that we need." They don't want to admit that when they actually needed the National Guard to respond to a disaster in Louisiana, they weren't there because of Bush's disastrous policies. And so it turns out, when I got Blackwater's contracts, that they've been hired by the Department of Homeland Security Federal Protective Service. Blackwater guys said they were making $350 a day. The company billed U.S. taxpayers $950 a day per man. At one point, the company was pulling in $240,000 a day for its Katrina operations. They had 600 men stretching from Texas through Mississippi and the Gulf. In November of 2005, Blackwater held a Hurricane Katrina fundraiser. They raised, Paul Bremer was the keynote speaker. They raised $138,000, so a bit more than half their daily take at one point of their Katrina operation. Out of the rubble of Hurricane Katrina, Blackwater saw opportunity. They started a whole new division of the company for domestic operations. They began aggressively pursuing the domestic market. A couple weeks ago, they opened a new training facility in Mount Carroll, Illinois. They're calling it Blackwater North. It's not far from the Wisconsin border. Then they thought they quietly would arrive out here in San Diego County and open up private military law enforcement training center in the rural community of Potrero. Never in a million years did Blackwater imagine that they would face an indigenous uprising from a community of 1,000 people. You know, I was out there in Potrero today, and several of the folks out there said they'd never participated in any demonstration before, and that they weren't really interested in these issues. It's a really peaceful community, really wonderful people out there. Blackwater shows up in their community, and about half the registered voters there signed a petition calling for a stoppage of the project of Blackwater's expansion into their community. Over 150 protesters showed up at a routine planning meeting. They had to bring out a massive show of security to face down against these non-violent residents in Potrero. Some of them had t-shirts on that said, "Stop Blackwater." And what I'm hearing as I travel around California is so many people in cities around this state, whether it's Los Angeles or Berkeley or Oakland or Santa Barbara, people are saying, "I want to go to Potrero." And so I want to close by just saying something briefly about the state of the media right now. I think that we have to, as we talk about U.S. soldier deaths in Iraq, as we talk about the ongoing disastrous situation there, we have to remember that 655,000 Iraqis have died since the invasion began. AP Ipsos did a poll a short time ago, and they asked Americans, how many Iraqis do you think have died since the invasion started? Most of the respondents said less than 10,000. This is a direct result of an anti-democratic media that plays cover-up for the Bush administration's wars. This is the direct result of a media that instead of serving as the fourth estate, is serving for the state. We all watched, I think, with utter horror, the events that happened in Virginia Tech. We know the names of so many of those students. We heard their stories. We heard from their mothers and their fathers and their classmates, and we heard the stories of bravery of a Holocaust survivor who was a teacher there who threw himself in front of the door to save the students. We've heard about the innocents stolen, the lives lost. We've heard these stories over and over because the media did a great job of covering those stories. We now know so much about the lives and deaths of these young people. Virginia Tech is one day in one Iraqi neighborhood. Imagine if for just 24 hours or 48 hours, we had the kind of coverage of the Iraqi victims of this war that we saw in the coverage of the Virginia Tech shooting. If the media was doing its job, and we knew the names of some of those 655,000 people, and we heard the stories about the little girl whose father was shot at a checkpoint because he didn't know English and he didn't know the word stop. If we heard the stories of the mothers whose children were killed by cluster bombs, if we knew something about the daily lives of these folks in Iraq who are suffering so terribly, this war would end tomorrow. This war would end tomorrow. We are a country of good-natured people who don't believe in wanton violence, who don't believe in offensive, aggressive wars. We don't believe in killing civilians. And the fact of the matter is that the media has systematically failed to show the true face of war. And the true face of war is the suffering people of Iraq and those caskets that keep coming home to this country because of this misguided war based on lies. And so I want to thank you all for coming out tonight. I really appreciate you taking the time to be here.
We have a few minutes for questions, and if you can wait, we'll try to get this wireless mic to you. First one right here.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation. Can you tell me, earlier in your speech, you said I believe that Blackwater was had bases in 9 countries. Can you tell me what those 9 countries are?
that comes from Blackwater's own vice president. And the countries that I know Blackwater is operating in or has operated in are Iraq, Afghanistan, Jordan, Kuwait, Azerbaijan, which is right near Iran, and then the United States. The other three, I couldn't tell you at this point.
Thank you for coming. I know you're not a lawyer, but do you know if private militias are even a constitutional entity in the well-regulated militias?
I'm not a lawyer. I have talked with a lot of constitutional experts on this issue, and not to just be brushing off, but my understanding is that it is very complicated to boil it down to legal issues. What I will say is that we're supposed to have something called the Posse Comitatus Act, which bans the active duty military from engaging in domestic law enforcement. Now, Bush has manipulated some of the laws now where it makes it easier to declare states of emergency and wipe that out. But I don't see much of a difference between having the active duty military engaging in domestic law enforcement and Blackwater forces showing up and talking about confronting criminals and stopping looters, except that there's actually a system of accountability within the military, and within Blackwater you have it as a private company. I should say it wasn't just Blackwater that was engaged in these kinds of private security operations as they looked them in New Orleans. I met Israeli commandos who had been hired by a wealthy business owner to come in and defend his gated community. They set up a checkpoint on the streets of New Orleans. They were stopping cars. They had automatic weapons. And they would tap on the weapons, and they said to me, when the Palestinians would see these things, it didn't scare them because they're used to it, but when Americans see these things, they get really frightened. Imagine seeing Israeli commandos operating a checkpoint on the streets of the U.S. city. There were over 140 private security companies that were operating in the state of Louisiana in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. Because it pulls all of us further away from any system of open government, from any system of accountability and oversight. I think we're at a constitutional crisis right now in this country.
I'm a community college professor here in San Diego, and I've had several of my students have been Iraqi war veterans, and two of them related an interesting story to me related in Blackwater, in that their unit, one was a Marine, another was in the Army, they actually had to go and rescue Blackwater operatives. There were several occasions where they were not coordinated with units operating in Baghdad and the other areas, and so they actually placed the Marines and the Army soldiers at greater risk and peril. So my question is, why hasn't the Army and the Marine Armed Forces spoken up more about this issue? Because they were saying that several scary instances where they were almost killed because they had to save these contractors.
You know, one of the, I appreciate your comments there, and one of the stories I tell in my book is how during a firefight in the Iraqi city of Najaf in 2004, Blackwater mercenaries actually assumed command over an active duty U.S. Marine. And the Marine actually asked Blackwater operatives for permission to open fire. Directly related to your point, and I almost thought you were quoting this here, the Government Accountability Office said the following, this is a quote: "Private security contractors continue to enter the battle space in Iraq without coordinating with the U.S. military, putting both the military and security providers at greater risk." That's the Government Accountability Office. These forces have also created a morale crisis among the active duty forces. Some of the best paid mercenaries in Iraq can clear $30,000 pay a month. That's how much some soldiers get into gear. So imagine if you're a young kid who signs up for the military or the National Guard because you wanted to get a college education. You end up in Iraq, you've got a Vietnam-era flak jacket on. Your mother's back home trying to raise money to get you some real body armor. And then the mercenaries whiz by, and they got better armor and better weapons than you. You know that they're making in a month what you make in a year. You look at them and you either say, what message is my country sending me? When I'm wearing red, white, and blue flag on my shoulder, and these guys are working for a private company, and we're in the same war zone, and they're getting paid exponentially more than I am. Or they say, I want to be like those guys, so I'm going to leave the military, and I'm going to go over to the private sector and make the real money if I have to be over here anyway. And so they, the slang now on the ground in Iraq is when you go from the active military to any private security company, they call it going Blackwater. And one of the major issues that the Department of Defense identified late last year was the very one that you just raised. that there's no effective coordination happening, and you have situations of conflict emerging between contractors and contractors in the U.S. military. And another part of this that we don't really talk a lot about is when we're not paying attention to the activities and actions of these private forces, we don't know what they're doing. We don't know what crimes they're committing. We don't know what killings are taking place. We don't know what torture is taking place. That also can have a serious blowback on the active duty forces because Iraqis don't differentiate between a mercenary and a U.S. soldier. It's all the occupation stuff. So you've got 130,000 people over there that no one's really paying effective attention to, and on many levels it's very disturbing.
Hi, welcome to San have you talked to the lawyers that are suing these people, and are you going to write a secret?
Well, I've tried to get Blackwater, anyone from Blackwater, to give me an on-the-record interview, and they refused. I finally wrote the company a letter. Well, I mean, they represent Blackwater, so they would need the permission of their clients to receive it. Blackwater wrote me a letter saying that they appreciate my interest in the company, but they would be unable to accommodate my request for interviews. I did hear from Blackwater's lawyers, though. They sent me a letter right when my book came out, and they said, we respect your First Amendment right to criticize Blackwater. I wasn't aware that a private company had to respect my rights. But you need to take down your website. They told me I needed to take down my website, which is blackwaterbook.com, and they cited some corporate competition clause and said I couldn't use their name, essentially. So we wrote the back letter and said the website would remain where it is, but I've never had a conversation with any of the lawyers representing Blackwater. I did meet Eric Prince once. I tried to ask him questions about the Fallujah ambush, and he sort of played a cat and mouse chase around game at a Mercenary conference. And then Blackwater's vice president sort of snuck in, a big Marine, and said to me, "May I help you?" That's sort of the extent of my communications with companies. About the sequel. No, I mean, I to bring it back to a more serious thing, I mean, I never intended to write a book. And I think, like a lot of you, I reached a moment where I was just shocked at the level of privatization at play and the kind of rampant unaccountability that exists. And so my goal in writing this book was to try to provide information for people so that they can make informed decisions about the kinds of policies that they want to support or oppose. But I never intended to write a book. I'm not planning on writing another book. This is just a product of investigative journalism that happened to be in the form of a book rather than articles.
Since you've been to Detroit, you realize that your proximity to the border out in the center. And also in your book, in the index, there is an individual who has a lot to do with deeper meaning. Duncan Hunter has a lot to do with these issues. And I would say that in his history, his involvement and his quote, "God bless the contractors," which he repeats often, is something that everyone in this room, Democrats and others, should be paying attention about his shenanigans and his lack of credibility growing day by day. The second comment is, do you think that the position of this training camp has something to do with the future privatization of Border Patrol activities that is going to be happening as we speak, along with the recent arrival, well, 2 years ago, the arrival of Israeli border chief, the chief of the border police in Israel is here giving conferences to high-level police agencies.
Thank you for that question. In January of 2006, KBR, which is the largest war contractor in Iraq, was awarded a $385 million contract from the Department of Homeland Security to provide what they called temporary detention and processing capabilities. And the contract called for preparing for, quote, an emergency influx of immigrants or to support the rapid development of new programs, close quote, in the event of other national emergencies such as natural disasters. There is a radical privatization agenda at play within the Department of Homeland Security. Blackwater's president, Gary Jackson, has testified in front of congressional committees favoring a privatization of the training of Border Patrol and other border-related activities. Blackwater also is marketing its surveillance blimps that it manufactures to the Department of Homeland Security, perhaps for use in monitoring the U.S.-Mexico border. It's hard when you go down to Potrero not to imagine that in someone's mind somewhere they're not thinking 3 to 5 miles from the U.S.-Mexico border, not far from Duncan Hunter's main wall down there. It's a apartheid wall. And I think that we need to look at the fact that this is a strategic location. It's near Camp Pendleton. It's in an area of the country that they like to portray as a Republican military part of the country. It's a very tranquil, removed community. It comes down in that valley, although it's very easy to create a sort of cordon around the area. And I think it's very disturbing that Blackwater now is looking at opening up a private military facility miles from the U.S.-Mexico border, given the political context that they now in.
The name of Duncan Hunter has been mentioned here. I would like, it's my honor to recognize an individual who held that seat and who brought honor to that seat, unlike President Trump. May I ask you to please recognize Lionel Van Zee. May I also ask if there are any members of the Potrero community here? Would you please stand and be recognized? Thank you so much.
Hi, thanks for coming out. You're an accomplished speaker as well as an apparent author. It's great to hear you talk. I noticed in today's paper, and I don't have my facts exactly right, but the head of the Potrero Planning Commission went to North Carolina and came back saying, based on what he saw, it's even a better idea than when he voted for it. Do you have any idea what wonderful things you may have seen at Blackwater's North Carolina facility?
I don't know, maybe Blackwater's yacht that I heard is positioned off the marina here. I don't know. You know, I think that I also heard from another reporter today that there's talk of having any future planning group meetings go into closed session. And I was hearing from residents today that they're very disturbed about that. You know, Blackwater, we have to remember, this is a very PR-savvy, sophisticated company that has really learned how to wax the system effectively. And they certainly knew how to grease the wheels of the Republican-controlled Congress. And I'm sure Mr. Hammers is no match for Blackwater when it comes to the waxing of those kinds of wheels. So I would imagine that he had a grand old time out there in Moyac, North Carolina.
I just want to thank you also, as everybody is. Sometimes information is overwhelming, this is so bad, and it's really nice to have people like you tracking it for us and bringing this to us. Appreciate that. I get very confused about how the money, like the $400 billion, how the money gets to these contractors. Does it come directly in contracts with our government? Does it go to the military and the military does it? And how does it get anywhere? And how accountable can our Congress be held for that kind of system? How much is it above ground and underground? Can you talk a little bit about the money?
Well, much of the funding that you're referring to comes through the kind of Iraq supplemental spending bills that were just passed by the Congress. I think it's unfortunate that the Democratic leadership forged ahead with this plan. They gave the president even more money than he had asked for, and they did nothing effectively to address the war contractor system or the war profiteering that's happening in Iraq. The fact is that if the leader of the Democrats in the Senate, Harry Reid, is going to say that the war is lost, how can he then turn around and provide the president with more money than he even asked for to wage that lost war? Specifically answer your question, in the case of Blackwater, they're being paid by the U.S. State Department. They're on contract with the U.S. State Department. I asked the State Department if that was a separate contract with the State Department or if it came out of the Iraq spending. They said, the State Department responded and said it comes out of the Iraq spending. Much of this comes from the same pot of the federal treasury. And then it's funneled through these Iraq supplementals. But then many of these companies operate with a subcontractor system. where you sometimes have 3 or 4 layers of subcontractors under which these various entities are buried. And then it becomes very murky waters to track that money, how it was spent, what it was used for. One concrete story I can tell you is this. Henry Waxman, beginning in November of 2004, tried to get one simple question answered. Who was paying for those 4 Blackwater guys that got killed in Fallujah? Seems like a simple enough question. Who were they working for other than Blackwater? In other words, where was the contract? What was its relation to the U.S. taxpayers? From November of 2004, and Henry Waxman is a pretty powerful player in Congress, it took him from November of 2004 until January 7th, 2007 to get an answer to that question. And it turned out that KBR had actually billed taxpayers $20 million for those services. And so the Army said that it was going to reclaim that money from KBR. That's one incident, one company, one contract, and it took one of the most influential members of Congress dealing with oversight, now the chair of the Oversight Committee, about 3 years to get an answer to that question. Replicate that across the system and you have a sense of the kind of accountability and oversight that's at play here right now. It's shocking. It is shocking. And so we have a situation now where I have offices of members of Congress calling me to ask me information about this contracting system. And I mean, I'm happy to share what information I have, but just as a citizen of this country, it's a bit disturbing to me that congressional offices are calling journalists and not the other way around.
How do you explain the simplicity of the threat?
Well, so how do you explain the publicity of the press and all this? You know, I think in a way that's the answer is not so exciting to that question. We've seen a systematic defunding of international news bureaus, shutting down of the international coverage. I think that we have way too many journalists in bed with the military and not enough unembedded journalists reporting objectively on the situation in Iraq. But also I think there's something that's more fundamentally at play here. We live in an age of infotainment journalism. It's much more important who the father of Anna Nicole Smith's baby is than who's being killed in Iraq. And it's the media that set the tone for how the rest of the country is going to respond to things. Now, I'm sure a lot of folks in this room seek out alternative sources of information and independent news, but a lot of people are so busy that they end up relying on what they see on the television. And I feel like we have a media system in this country right now that doesn't need censors. We don't need government censors because the self-censorship is happening in the newsrooms of America and the editorial departments of newspapers, to the point where some of these publications are serving as conveyor belts for the lies of the administration, as the New York Times did to lead up to the war. I watch the news sometimes and I feel like if we had state media in this country, how would it actually look any different? The barons of the Soviet media empire would be blushing with embarrassment watching the coverage of the Iraq War and politics and stolen elections in this country.
A couple of weeks ago, I believe there was a piece on Blackwater, I believe it might have been 60 Minutes, and there was a guy named Colford Black, who was apparently one of the directors. He's a very high-level CIA guy, I guess he figured in 911. I'm wondering what you know about the books are in the high levels of the intelligence and military.
I mean, I usually, as part of my talk, I usually tell the story of Colford Black. I have a whole chapter on it in my book. I'll make this brief, but it's actually a pretty important part of the story. By the way, Colford Black, who up until now has been, I call him the number 2 guy at Blackwater. Mitt Romney just hired him. He's now his top advisor on counterterrorism for his campaign. Colford Black is one of the most famous spies in U.S. history. He's a 30-year veteran of the Central Intelligence Agency. He was the man who caught Carlos the Jackal, the famed international terrorist in Sudan. Black himself had been marked once for death by Osama bin Laden in Khartoum when the bin Laden group determined that in the early 90s that Black was not, in fact, a diplomat, was using that as cover, that he was in the CIA. On 9/11, Colford Black was the top counterterrorism official at the CIA. He was head of the CIA's counterterrorism center. On September 13, 2001, he's in the White House Situation Room with President Bush, and he tells President Bush, as he's speaking about the deploying small teams of special forces to Afghanistan. And he's throwing papers on the ground to sort of dramatize the moment. He tells the president, when we're through with them in Afghanistan, they're going to have flies crawling across their eyeballs. He became known as the flies on the eyeballs guy. He goes over with Dick Armitage to Moscow, just with the Deputy Secretary of State under Colin Powell, just before the U.S. attacked Afghanistan. And the Russians were warning Coker Black and Armitage about the Soviet experience in Afghanistan. Coker Black shoots back at the Russians. We're going to put their heads on pikes. He's this guy who's sort of seemingly obsessed with corporal mutilation. He's a man who stood in front of Congress and said there was a before 9/11 and an after 9/11, and after 9/11 the gloves come off. And what he meant by the gloves coming off were the kind of policies that he was at the forefront of implementing. Coker Black was one of the key men responsible for the extraordinary rendition program used under the Bush administration, where people are abducted off of the streets of cities, not just in far-off places, but also here in the U.S., as in the case of Maher Arar, who was kidnapped out of JFK Airport, a Canadian citizen, sent to a third country where they're tortured in a hellhole, sometimes being read questions provided by U.S. interrogators. This is a guy who was at the epicenter of some of the most brutal policies of the war on terror, number 2 man at Blackwater, now a staffer for Mitt Romney. He also, a few weeks ago, announced that he was one of the senior executives in a new privatized intelligence company being bankrolled by Eric Prince, the head of Blackwater. It's called Total Intelligence Solutions. It's him, Robert Richards, the former deputy director of operations at the CIA, and another former senior CIA official named Enrique Rick Prado. Those 3 men have joined forces with Blackwater to create this privatized intelligence company, which that's a whole other discussion. It's very scary stuff. And that's Coker Black.
Thank you very much. What we'd like to do now is, Jim, we can ask you to take a seat at the table over here, get some of these people who have your book, get a chance to get that. Let's take a moment here. If anybody has any question as to whether or not there are people in this community that are concerned, just look around you. Look how we filled this place up, and we filled another hall last night. There are people out here who have clipboards with sheets that you can write comments on that will go to the Planning Commission. Please avail yourself of those. I'm going to do the drawing right now.